Okay, what's up?
My name is.
My name is Steve, and life is good, and this is made in Cosa Mortis. I hope nobody dies watching. I want to start by saying that it may be hard to follow this whole thing chronologically, because during my life, I never did one thing at a time. I had several jobs at the same time. I went to school and had jobs at the same time. I stopped during the summer to work in camps. So there's it doesn't feel like a lot of continuity, but do the best you can. And I'll move into, the reason I'm doing this is because in 2006, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. And the cancer is now progressing aggressively, so I don't expect to live a great deal longer. And I wanted to share aspects of my life with people who I care about and who care about me. And, people that know me sometimes only know me in very small parts of my life. So I wanted to sort of share a more of a larger picture.
And also, you said something about that you felt like talking about your life. Within talking about your life, it shows how it's made it easier for you to come to grips with this part of your life.
Yeah. Generally, well, let me just say, for me, the notion of dying is not scary. It's not depressing. And I think the reason for that is because I've had a very rich life, a very satisfying life. And some of the things I'll be talking about demonstrate, why it was so satisfying. And I think that contributes to what makes it easier for me to accept and come to grips with the fact that it's going to end.
I'm sure it's comforting to anybody watching it, which is probably part of why you want to say that.
I hope. Anyway, I think I'll start with, love and family and friends, because I think that's the richest part of my life. And, I also want to begin by saying, for me, family is more than just biology. I want to start with Aura, my friend and wife and love, and what a significant and great choice that was. Not easy for me. My own initial experiences with family, having lost my mother when I was 6 and struggling with that in sort of very primitive ways, blaming myself. My mother was 29 when she passed. Made it very difficult for me to have trust in intimate relations. And, so I met Aura in 1974. We got married in 1981. And
How did you meet?
Aura participated in a community education group that I ran through. I was the director of a substance abuse agency, and ultimately, Aura joined the board of directors of that agency and was the coordinator of volunteers. And so, that's how we met. And
Do you remember your first impression?
well, Aura was beautiful, and so, I thought I was attracted to her, and then there were other things about her. She carried herself with certain royalty. It's interesting. because she had some areas of self-doubt, but in your initial impressions, you wouldn't capture that because she, conveyed a certain sense of command. So she was attractive in that way, in that form of strength. And it took 7 years of ups and downs, and we got married in 1981. And we've been together as husband and wife and as partners since then. There was some periods of separation and partial separation when I was in North Dakota, but there's a solidity to it. And I remember struggling with the question of whether to have more children, and we'll get into other parts of the family, but or had 3 children, and I had 1, and we kind of compromised on having foster children, which was kind of something I was more into than Aura was. So I appreciated and still appreciate that. Between us, we've had 22 foster children, one of whom has remained as a member of the family, along with his 2 children. So, they're, Omar, my son, and Brandon and Tyrese, my grandsons, and their family, and there's a lot of love there. And also there was a woman that was a client at the substance abuse agency named Iris, who retained a relationship with and gave her away at her wedding, and I consider her and her husband and Mike and Sammy family. And of course, Aura's children, who I love as my children, and I feel loved by them as their father, not taking anything away from their biological father, who they love also, but I never felt less than a father to them, and the grandchildren that they gave me, Jacob and Mika and Amalia. These people, have tremendous richness to my life, and then of course my son John and his wife Robin, and my grandchildren Kira, Henry, and Rhiannon. Also, recently on Father's Day, in fact, Father's Day weekend, I had an opportunity to have lunch with my son John and Kira and Henry, the 2 older grandchildren. Robin and Rhiannon were visiting other grandparents in Illinois, and I told my grandchildren that at their father's wedding, I made a toast, and I said, that John was the son that every father dreamed of having, and that what I wished for him at that time was that he should be so lucky to have a child or children that he could feel that way about. I didn't think it was likely because I felt so fortunate, but in fact, you know, you two and Rhiannon I think John feels the same way, that you're the children every father dreams of having, and the grandchildren that every grandfather dreams of having. And, you know, sometimes, you know, as you know, I come to California and I've watched Robin swim, and I've gone to different places to watch her play volleyball, and Akira, and basketball and whatnot, and Henry's baseball and basketball, and both of them jiu-jitsu. And I sometimes worry that, and Rhiannon's softball and basketball and soccer, and the plays they've all been in. I sometimes worry that they think that what I love about them is their achievements, you know, in these activities and in sports and in school. But really, you know, it's the kind of people that they've become and they're becoming in terms of the love they show for each other and the understanding and compassion they show for other people and for world issues. You know. Anyway, it's, you know, I'm grateful for all of these families that I've, you know, talked about, and the richness they've brought to my life. And I hope mine to theirs. And, you know, I mean, I've experienced different kinds of love in my life from friends and colleagues and people I've worked with. I was thinking of saying something about each of them, but, you know, I hope I've communicated personally to all of these people that have added richness to my life. And I don't know if I can convey adequately how much so many different people have meant to me, but I hope I've let them know, you know, personally, how much it's meant. So, anyway, let me skip to a different area, because in addition to love and family, part of the richness of my life has been my work life. And my work life, you know, began as a young teenager when I delivered newspapers for the Long Island Press, and as a you know, 15, 16-year-old as a copy boy for the Long Island Press, and later on as a copy boy for the New York Post. And then as a 17-year-old just starting college as a parking lot attendant. And, you know, in many ways, my work experience, even in these jobs that don't seem that significant, really were the basis of my education as a human being. I met different people and came to slowly understand the complexity of the differences between people and the similarities between people, and the struggle that people have in understanding themselves, one another, and respecting the differences. I remember as a parking lot attendant, I worked with a variety of people, but I remember particularly two men from Nicaragua, very different. One, devoted husband and father, and the other, a bit of a, what we might call wayward drinking person. And how these people who came from the same culture, had a very different moral compass, but both easy to get along with. Somewhere at the core of their humanity, they were good people, although some of the actions of one of them wouldn't be considered that good. Again, I was only 18 at the time, and it gave me a profound sense of how people are different, and how underneath they're similar. And I should say, beginning at the age of 15, my summers were spent in summer camps. I remember at the age of 15, I got a job as a waiter, waiter at Camp Loyaltown, Camp for Underprivileged Boys. And one of my great achievements in life was being promoted during that summer to pot washer. And at about 5 times the salary. And, at that experience, I saw counselors, some of whom loved the children they worked with, and some of whom abused the children they worked with. And, as a 15-year-old, I was, kind of unconscious and didn't have any sense of responsibility towards what was happening, but made a significant impression upon me. Again, how how people treat each other and the long-term impacts that kind of thing can have. So anyway, I continued during the summers to work in camps. I worked at Brant Lake Camp, Camp Idlewold, Camp Monroe. I can't even remember all the names of the camps, but I may come back to it. I deal with other aspects of my life. But after the parking lot job, of course, at that time I was a full-time student at Queens College. I was registered as a full-time student. I had a bit of I'm understating it, a gambling problem at that time, which started when I was in high school. And, I spent more time working than I did at school and did not do well at school. But, I remember one teacher that had this profound impression on me. I took what was supposed to be an advanced English course. Professor Filioun. I still remember 2 comments she made on different papers of mine. Now this goes back more than 50 years. She wrote on one paper, "Verbiage is garbage." And on another paper she wrote, "Now is the time to drop the shackles of the thoughtlessly irresponsible adolescent." And I didn't quite get it at that time, and I ended up failing that course. But here, more than 50 years later, I remember that comment, and I remembered it with different sensitivity at different times of my life, which was a big help to me as an individual and as a social worker working with teenagers that were struggling with similar issues. So, I did, it took me, well, I'm on work here, so let me stay with that. While I was a college student, or at least in name, I worked my way through college. I was living independently since I was, just before my 17th birthday. I lived in an apartment in Flushing near Queens College. And I earned a living, well, first as that parking lot attendant. I was a milkman delivering milk in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn. I was, later on, I was a milkman for, I forget the name of the company in Forest Hills. That was after my son was born. I was worked for the post office briefly. I worked as I had an important job at United Parcel Service, loading and unloading trucks at their plant on 44th Street and the West Side, and met a good friend there, Arthur Hudson, another person who had a profound impact on my life. Haven't seen him in years.
Who was the impact?
Well, Hudson was a person whose father had taken his own life early. And Hudson had different ways of managing the struggle around that issue. Had a volatile temper. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on Hudson's life, but he also had a profound sense of loyalty and friendship, and we were very close, and there was love there, and important to me. I kind of struggled with feeling not volatile enough, and gave a lot of thought to the differences and also the similarities between myself and this good friend. So there was United Parcel Service. I had been dismissed from school after 2.5 years because of my poor grades. Then I had to go at night to restore myself to matriculated status. And while I was going at night, I worked as a school bus driver. That was a 6-day-a-week job, full-time. I also drove a milk truck 2 nights a week while I was doing that, and went to school in between. And then after that period of time, I got back into school and returned to work both for United Parcel Service again, this time working in a plant in Queens. And there I had another kind of unforgettable experience. There was a young man working there, older than me, but in his 20s, from Africa, named Ben. And he was quiet. He had a sense of kind of a profound person. A lot of the other workers were ethnic New Yorkers, not at the forefront of progressiveness, and made it their business to kind of verbally torture this African man. And one time he had an ethnic hat, and one of them took it from him and was passing it around. And he was a wiry, if you looked at him, you might think he was skinny, kind of a guy. Again, quiet, unassuming, and they're throwing this around. There's a conveyor belt. It was a little break between these tractor trailers coming in to be unloaded, and he kind of looked like he lost control. He lifted up a much heavier guy, threw him down on the conveyor belt, had his forearm at his neck, where his head was hanging over the belt in a very vulnerable position. And in that position, he gave a speech about what it's like to be different and what it's like to feel a responsibility to your country and your people to behave in a certain way, to carry yourself with dignity. But sometimes you had to stand up for yourself in a way that wasn't that comfortable. And when he finished, he let this guy up. You could have heard a pin drop in the place. Everybody went back to work. But, you know, you have experiences like that, you know, they stay with you.
So many years ago. Why did it move you so much?
Yeah, that was actually about 47 years ago, 48 years ago. Well, you know, at that time, see, I was, I guess, 22, and you know, I was like, you know, conscious of racial issues and various ways in people, the way people mistreated one another, and also were supportive of one another, and also, you know, I was into thinking about what kind of a person I wanted to be, and what kind of qualities I looked up to, and you know, I mean, I didn't really know this fellow Ben very well, but he certainly, you know, on a certain level, was a role model after that experience, to try and imagine what he kept inside of him, and then his ability to express himself verbally when the time came when he felt he had to. So, yeah. So I was working, you know, at United Park. Anyway, I did get back into school full time, and you know, around that time my son was born, and you know, I got another job in Queens as a milkman, and you know, then I finished school. Well, no, the semester before I finished school, I needed 6 more credits to graduate. I had to get a regular job, so I got a job as a computer programming trainee for a company, big insurance company, MetLife, and I did that for 4 months. Then I got recommended to be the data processing manager of a company called Pat Fashions. That was when computers were, you know, they were tape drives and rooms full of computers, and they were doing things like inventory and payroll, not the kind of complex things that computers do now. And in fact, Pat Fashions didn't have its own computers. We used a service bureau to do the programming, and I was the person that was writing the specs for. But while I was working at that job, they assigned me to manage the layout of a factory in West New York, New Jersey. They were having trouble because it was being laid out in a way that it was very difficult to pick. So goods were being placed in front of other goods, and it was taking a long time for the workers to pick orders to ship out. And you know, I had another, again, awakening experience at that job. So I was sort of in a management position, and I used to have lunch with the controller of the company and the warehouse manager, and in those discussions, I became aware that these two management people were stealing large sums of money from the company through a variety of mechanisms, which I don't need to go into the details of. And then it came to pass that one of the pickers had stolen 2 sweaters for his children. Now, I should say something about these pickers. They lived in Brooklyn. They were Hispanic. They had to take the subway to the path into New Jersey, and then a bus to work. And they were paid about minimum wage at the time. And then the discussions, the union representing the pickers were challenging the dismissal of this guy for stealing 2 sweaters, which were probably worth about $1 to the company. And the discussion about it between this controller and the warehouse manager was, where does the union get off defending these fucking spick thieves? And I'm saying to myself, there's a disconnect here. These guys are really thieves. They're taking big time money. This was a privately owned company, by a guy. Well, I don't want to go into the details about the company. It's kind of interesting, but and they're just stealing money from him. And this, poor individual. Not that I'm defending the taking of the 2 sweaters, but it was the attitude that struck me. It's a disconnect between like the judgments that people make about others and the lack of capacity to be self-reflective about who they are. So again, I was a young man in my early 20s. And anyway, so I'm working at that job. I had always wanted to be a teacher. And, I'll talk about why that was significant to me at some point, I hope. But it comes along my good friend Arthur Hudson, who is now a sales manager for a company called Amsco Review Books. And one of the people working for him left the job, and he made me an offer that I could replace this person. I wouldn't have to sell any books. He would cover the territory, and we would split the pay. So it's not a totally honest thing to do, but it gave me an opportunity to leave what was a decently paying job and consider going back to teaching. This was in the late spring, so I took another job as a head counselor of a camp. I went to camp with my wife at the time and my young son. And during that summer, my mother-in-law sent me this advertisement for a social worker at the Staten Island Jewish Community Center to do young adolescent programming and to be the assistant physical education director. So I didn't mention one of the part-time jobs I had when I was going to school over several years was as a group worker at Lenox Hill Neighborhood Association, where I was supervised by a social worker. And my God, it was that was like sort of a eye-opener, because this supervisor, Leela Matthews, her name was, an Indian woman, when I met with her once a week, I mean, it was like looking into a mirror. She would confront every piece of motivation, every action. She talked about purposefulness. You use yourself purposefully. I was used to being unconscious. I had some skills in working with kids, but they weren't purposeful. And anyway, so I did that. I worked with a group. I worked with I was a swim instructor. I worked as a street worker with teenagers there over a long period of time. And so when it came time to apply for this job as a social worker, I had these years of camp experience and this experience at Lenox Hill Neighborhood Association. So they hired me. The starting salary was more than I could make as a teacher. And I took the job, and as it turned out, worked out very well for me. I was good at it. They made me the director of teen programming. Was the end of the phys ed piece, and my second year there, they hired me as a separate part-time job as a nursery school teacher. So I had this great experience for a year teaching 4-year-olds. And anyway, also in my second year, the teenagers I was working with developed this event called the Staten Island Walk on Hunger. And they recruited kids from high schools all over Staten Island to walk 26 miles and raise money for Hunger in America and some Mexican hunger program, and for the some housing, some housing agency in Staten Island, and they raised over $60,000. And UGA Federation, which was a supporter of the Staten Island Jewish Community Center, was apparently impressed by this, and they offered to pay for me to go to school for my master's degree in social work. They paid me $7,500 and my tuition, and so I began, in a way, my career as a social worker. So I went to school. I continued working part-time at the Staten Island Jewish Community Center. Then, in my second year of graduate school, the Education Alliance, where I had done my first year field placement, hired me part-time as a community organizer. Then they let me take my son to direct a summer camp. I mean, I directed the camp. He went to a day camp that was part of the overall facility. And I came back in that September as a full-time community organizer. But it turns out that the person who was my supervisor in my first year there had come back to the agency to run a large federal drug abuse program, and he recommended me for the director of this job in Staten Island, which they hired me as the director of that program, and that job, most importantly, led to my meeting Aura, but in addition, led to my beginning career as a professor, because it was about 1974 I started teaching as an adjunct, a professor of social work, which I did at Adelphi University for 20 years. I worked at Yeshiva University as an adjunct at Stony Brook. I had a full-time position at Stony Brook for a while as a professor. And ultimately, before I went to North Dakota, I came back to the Education Alliance as the assistant executive director. Then of course, I didn't talk about my education, and I will, but during the time I was the director of SCAN, I went to law school, so I was a full-time director, part-time adjunct professor, and full-time law student. And so I was also a lawyer.
Why did you decide to go to law?
Well, I had worked at SCAN for a few years, and most of the hours that I put in at SCAN as the director were afternoon and evening, because that's when the clients were available. In fact, I worked 5 nights a week, and I found that my mornings were free, and I thought about getting a PhD in psychology, but there was Hofstra Law School on Long Island advertised themselves as a public interest law school. Thought it would be an interesting combination, law and social work. So I applied. I didn't really expect to get in because, I didn't, as I mentioned, my college career was spotty. I'm giving myself credit by calling it spotty. But, I was the executive director of a large agency. We had members of our board and our advisory boards who were local politicians and superintendent of schools. So I was heavily recommended. I did very well on the LSATs, those law school admission tests. And they admitted me and I went. I didn't really find it that much of a public interest law school. It was more personal interest for lawyers. But, I did get my law degree. I finished in 1977, but I didn't start practicing law until 1980. And that was kind of accidental because I was doing some consulting work for the Merrick Union School District as a part-time thing. It was meeting with sixth graders and their parents, helping them anticipate the transition to junior high school. And I was supposed to be paid $100 an hour for this work. After I completed the work, the school district said that their funding source was not going to pay that kind of money, and they tendered me significantly less money for the work that I had done. And I was a law student at the time, and I sued them pro se, and pro se means, without a lawyer. And there was a law firm that represented the school district, Medawar and Kroll. And, I had passed the statute of limitations to do this, not the statute of limitations, but to sue a municipality, you had, I think it was 90 days to file a notice of claim. I didn't know that. And I filed late. They asked it to be dismissed. And, I was doing some legal research at the time. There's a doctrine called equitable estoppel. Anyway, I won that case. They had to pay me. And the law firm, while we were involved in the lawsuit, they found out that I was a student, and that, and then a few years, I guess in 1980, I was in court with a substance abuse client as a social worker, and I ran into Jerry Medawar, who was an attorney, and he asked me, what I'm doing. I told him I'm here. He says, well, what about your law? So I said, well, I'm really a social worker. He said, Bud, you don't want to waste your law degree. So I said, well, it's not really a waste. And he said, well, why don't you come and work with me and Bob? So I said, well, I'm not really interested in being an employee, and I'm not ready to give up my job as a social worker. He says, no, come. You only take the cases you're interested in. We'll give you some cases, and we'll send out invitations, announcements, and we'll make an arrangement where you give us a percentage of your fees, so you're not working for us, and you could use our secretaries. So it was a sort of an offer I couldn't refuse. So I went to work as a lawyer, and because I was known in the, Syosset, Plainview, Woodbury community, I got a lot of business, and it soon became impossible for me to continue being the director of the agency and having a law practice. In fact, I had too much business for the secretaries at Medawar and Kroll, so then I opened my own practice as a lawyer in Plainview.
It's interesting that the law firm who you beat,
yeah,
you beat them in a lawsuit. They want to do some work with them.
Well, another interesting aspect of that is Jerry Medawar, who was a gentleman in his 60s at the time, actually audited one of my social work classes. I don't know, we had some kind of a connection. Anyway, Yeah.
Did you do law because at this point, for the money, because you really liked the law practice?
No, I didn't really like the law practice, but there were some things that gave me satisfaction. I represented a lot of women who couldn't afford, good lawyering, and in fact, I had a case of modification of child support, which went before the New York State Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York State. We won on trial, family court. We lost at the appellate division, and then we got the case reversed at the Court of Appeals. And, that was very satisfying. I was able to be helpful to people in a way that was satisfying to me. But it was also boring. I had a secretary named Madeline. Oh, she was wonderful. She ultimately passed away, but it was like in many of the areas of law, like real estate, which I really hated. I remember clients would call me with a question. I'd say, that's a complicated question. Give Madeline a call. She had come to me with quite a bit of experience, and she was very competent, a wonderful person. Anyway, so I didn't make much money in the matrimonial area, but I also did criminal work and personal injury work, in which when you're a personal injury attorney, you're your client's partner. You don't have to take money from them. You get a percentage of recovery. And so I did well there. And I worked as a full-time lawyer, I guess, for about 6 years or so. And then by that time, my sons, John and Matthew, Matthew was Aura's son, but I still feel a possessory interest, went off to school. And Aura and I kind of retired at that time. We bought a Vanagon, and we were traveling around. But we did invest in a business for Joelle, our daughter, in Harvard Square, which, afterwards we weren't as rich as we thought we were. So we had to come back and go to work.
What kind of business?
It was a business called Artisan. It was a retail business, hand-turned things that people made and were sold in the store. But the store was doing better after a while, but then there were 2 armed robberies. It was terrifying, and we closed the business, or Joelle closed the business.
Just to back up one thing, what was this traveling around in the van? What was that about?
Well, we just, seeing the country. Well, one of the places we went was to Nashville, Tennessee. Oh, there's some great stories on that trip. We were not equipped. We weren't campers. We went to Nashville, Tennessee, and applied for jobs in the kitchen at the Grand Ole Opry. So my resume, I had trial attorney. Anyway, they didn't give us those jobs. One time we stopped along the side of the road, and we took out a table and chairs, and we had some lunch. And then we drove off and left the table and chairs. One time we were at a campgrounds, and we plugged in, the electricity, and the Vanagon had you could roll up a top, and there was a bed, and then we pull out the next morning. We don't unplug it. We pull out with the plug in it, and then we're driving along the highway. And I said, gee, I think there's something wrong with the car. I keep pressing on the accelerator, and nothing's happening. And then we pull off, and we see that we never unrolled the canopy, so it was creating this huge resistance. Anyway, but it was a fun trip. And then we came back, and so I'm on work. I came back and I worked for Jacoby and Myers as an attorney for a while. I had closed up my own practice. I worked at Little Flower Children's Services as a supervisor of social work in the group homes, and that's where I met a number of kids that ultimately became foster children, although we had foster children before that. And when I talked about family, well, I did talk about Omar, and I did say we had 22 foster children, and that was, incredibly satisfying, but also many times very frustrating, sometimes scary. But on balance, it was, I think, tremendous experience.
Why did you do it?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, as I said before, I was interested in having more children. And this was a bit of a compromise between Ora and myself. I mean, my role as a father was significant to me, and I felt I had something to offer. One of the things I learned, we had mostly teenagers as foster children, not all, but mostly. And, with all of the skills that I thought I had, I found that even being a 24-hour-a-day helping person with the advantage of having children in your own home, there were kids had troubles that were beyond my capacity to help, and it was an eye-opener. I learned a lot about, the sometimes the irreparable damage that is done as kids grow up. But I don't want to say irreparable because I couldn't find a way, that doesn't mean that nobody could have. We connect with people for different reasons, and it's not just a matter of skill or commitment or caring. Sometimes it's something that's indefinable. So I think it's important not to give up on people. On the other hand, it's also important to hold people accountable for their behavior. I mean, I'm not a liberal when it comes to criminal behavior. I think it's not useful either to the perpetrator or to the society to be soft on people that hurt other people. For me, the purpose of the criminal justice system is to protect as opposed to punish. So while I may think it's necessary to put somebody in jail, I may feel for that person. I don't hate them. I may even love them. But I don't want them, hitting somebody I love over the head with a baseball bat. So it's, again, part of the richness of my life is realizing that there are very few simple answers. Life is a very complex thing, particularly human life, but even just the way things work naturally, very complicated, things we have no control over, or some things we do have control over and choose not to have control over them, like environmental things and things like that. But anyway, I think one of the problems we have politically is that it seems to work to get votes to have simple answers to complex problems. People don't want to hear about complexity. It's scary. But unfortunately, we live in a complex world with complex problems, and the solutions have to be complex also. Anyway, that's a little preaching from the social work dais or whatever. Anyway, so I was a lawyer, and then I came back, and I mentioned I went back to the Education Alliance as as a assistant executive director. And then I took a stab at getting a PhD in social work, which didn't work out. I'm not going to exactly go into the details of that. But while I was in that program, I applied for a position as a full-time faculty member at the University of North Dakota. I applied at a variety of places. But I took the job at North Dakota, because even though I didn't have the PhD at the time, they hired me to teach graduate classes. B, there was a handball community, which I'm going to get to later. And C, there was a community theater community, which I'll also get to later. So I took that job, and it was a good decision. Actually, I had taken another job, and I had to tell them that North Dakota took forever to decide to hire me. So I had taken this other job, and I had to tell them that I changed my mind, which I felt a little guilty about. But anyway, I went to North Dakota, stayed there for 13 years. When I went there, they told me that I couldn't receive tenure there unless I completed the PhD program. But when it came time 4 years later for me to apply for tenure, the application process took a couple of years. The department petitioned the university to accept my Juris Doctor as a terminal degree in social work. And there was some controversy about, but they did. So I did get tenure and ended up staying in North Dakota for 13 years. And, I still hear from many of my students, and it was very satisfying. But while I was there, I did some practice of law in the federal courts, and had a very large case against the city, the county, the state, and individual professionals in social work and psychology for what I called both the intentional and negligent ignoring of key domestic violence issues. So I was representing a domestic violence victim who I felt that the system was oppressing as much as the perpetrator was oppressing. And this case dragged on for years, and it was a matter of controversy within my department. The chair of my department told me I could not do that. I could not, do a case like that. I appealed it through the college and the university. They supported me, but my department did not support me. And again, it was another eye-opening experience, because here among the university community, I got a great deal of respect for taking on the system. I was able to make presentations, in different countries on the systemic failures regarding domestic violence. But my department, my colleagues, some friends, were either against, sided with my department chair, or were silent. There were one or two who were not, who had the courage to, part of the problem at that time was there were only 3 tenured people in the department, and the non-tenured people, would take a big risk by opposing the chair. So it was complicated, but it was very disappointing. And in fact, in 2006, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was there at the university, and this was in October of 2006. In January, I came to New York for surgery. they did surgery in North Dakota, but actually I didn't come for surgery. They wouldn't give me surgery, but I ended up getting surgery in New York. And the same department chair who I had this ongoing conflict with supported me in getting paid for that time. I was able to come back in May. The semester was almost over, but they allowed me to come back, paid me again. Very supportive. And, you know, when I ultimately left in 2009, you know, I wrote a letter to the university saying how much I appreciated all of the years there, all of the satisfactions, but I did include this profound disappointment that the most important thing I had done in my 13 years there did not receive the support of my department.
You did or didn't?
I did, yeah. And
Did you get any response?
No.
Tell them why you didn't get the support.
I did. What?
Because they work with the agency.
Oh, well, you know, there were reasons why it was difficult for my department to support me. First of all, the County Department of Social Services, which was one of the defendants of the action, took in many of our students. They were colleagues with members of the faculty. You know, it was sort of like if you're a policeman, you know, ratting out other policemen. You know, there were some feelings about that. But in the social work community, there was also quite a bit of support. A lot of people understood that there were problems in the way the system responded to victims of domestic violence, not just in North Dakota, but, you know, all over the United States. And of course, it's worse in other places. I mean,
So it's very courageous on your part to do it then.
well, you know, I'd like to take that kind of credit, but the truth was, I didn't really need that job. I could, you know, I felt like I could work anywhere. I had a significant career as a social worker and as a professor. I was a lawyer, you know, and I was there. You know, Aura was still in New York. I used to come back on weekends and summers. So, you know, I didn't have exposure, family exposure to the conflict. I wasn't worried about the money. I mean, there were people who took much more courageous positions than I did, you know, with respect to that.
But it still meant the loss of friendship from your department. And
Yes, but even then, as I pointed out, my quotes arch enemy, you know, there was still a sense of mutual respect and tremendous support when I got sick. So, I mean, the fight was, it's sort of like in a say a sports match or a boxing match where you're trying to kill the other guy, but when the match is over, you have that respect, and so it wasn't really that courageous on my part. It was, I mean, I'm glad I did it, and I feel satisfied about it, but it is what it was.
Did they give you a party, or did people write letters to you when you?
Yes, they did. My department, you know, had a going away thing. You know, it's an interesting thing. It's a sort of a side issue, but you know, the community in Grand Forks, North Dakota, is a very religious-based community. The churches there was a synagogue, but the churches, you know, were the fundamental units of the community. And the churches in North Dakota, by and large, had tremendous leadership. The clergy was very humanistic, very interested in social service. Many of them did work not only in the community, but overseas. And I had foster children in North Dakota, so I actually attended church there, different churches, depending on the denomination of the foster child. It was a very impressive, you know, this, again, a little side story, but I'm with one of my foster children, waiting for Mass to begin. You sit in a little, like kind of a lunchroom, and somebody comes and serves you coffee and donuts. And so the person comes to the table and says, "Steve, how you doing?" I said, "Gee, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you." He said, "I'm your doctor." Just seeing him serving, it was so out of context. But that's how it was. But I was very open about the fact that I was an atheist. I wasn't an aggressive atheist. I was very respectful, obviously. I attended church, but, with foster children. But it's incredible about how many of my students, would come to me and say, "Can we pray for you? Do you mind?" Or, "Can we pray with you? Do you mind?" It was a beautiful thing. It didn't matter that I was an atheist. It's, there's kind of a little more to say about that whole, even recently, I get an email from, I didn't talk about the Group Work Association as part of work, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But we have a chapter, this International Professional Association in Lithuania. And I get an email from the president of that chapter telling me that on Friday night the whole chapter was going to church to pray for me. And they know also. I'm very open about the fact that I'm not a believer. But, there's a little funny story about that too. One of the guys I played handball with in North Dakota, Joe Swikinos, he was a very religious Lutheran, and he was concerned, a guy about my age, about my immortal soul. So he says to me, "Steve, your good works, they're not going to help you at the end, because, you have to take Jesus into your heart. That's the only way for immortal salvation." So I said to him, Joe was on the board of directors of the homeless shelter in Grand Forks, and he was he had foster children. So I said to him, "Joe, well, why do you do all the good works? Because you've already, accepted Jesus into your heart." And he said, and he's serious. And this guy had a PhD in biology. He was called the potato doctor because he studied, how to grow potatoes in a way that, made them last longer for different purposes. Anyway, he says to me, "Steve, you have to think of it this way. You have to think of heaven like a football stadium. Everybody who accepts Jesus gets in, but they don't all get the same seats." And, I was sort of tongue-in-cheek, but there was sort of a seriousness to it. And again, these are things that happen that teach you about the breadth of the way human beings experience themselves, morally, spiritually, metaphysically, etc. So, anyway, I sort of, well, let me say something about the Group Work Association. When I first became involved 20 some odd years ago, I was a pro bono, meaning I didn't get paid, attorney for the association. And, over the years, I was sort of what do they call it? I was on the board of directors, but not as a voting member. So I attended board meetings, and I was a social group worker, so I attended their annual symposia, and so many times, most of the time, presented papers there. And then can't remember, about my last year in North Dakota, they asked, there were problems with the organization. There were problems with the leadership. and there were problems, interpersonal problems among board members, and they asked me if I would be the president. You know, I had already been diagnosed with cancer, and I said, it's a 3-year term. I said, I'm not sure I'll last out the term, but, you know, if the organization wants me, you know, and I played a very peripheral role on the board. Sometimes I only came, you know, for a few hours of a 2-day meeting that had to do with legal issues. But nonetheless, they did elect me, and, you know, I spent 3 years as the president of the organization. And, you know, I had tremendous satisfaction in, I was instrumental in the creation of the German chapter and the creation of the Lithuanian chapter. But, you know, in some ways, that organization, not the Educational Alliance, not SCAN, where I was for 10 years, and not all these universities that I taught at, was my professional home. Because social group work is, you know, considered a professional method. But for me, underlying that, the thing that makes it so important, I mean, there are many things, but the thing that makes it so important, two things. One is the belief in the capacity of human beings to help each other. It's not a monopoly on professionals. That the social group worker's primary function is to help people help each other. This to me needs to catch on, you know, and this is one of the things that the association, through developing practice method, through research, and through teaching, you know, tries to do. And the other thing is respect for difference. It's an underlying value in the organization, helping people understand themselves in the context of the world around them, micro and macro, and to grow from understanding the differences and similarities between human beings, and not just understanding, but respecting those differences. And growing from the differences. This is, to me, these two things, respect for difference and the capacity to help one another, is what the world needs, you know. And so my contribution to that, professionally, may be the most important.
That's what your life's been about, those two.
Those two values. Even in the practice of law, you know, I was guided by those values. You know, I don't know what to say, but it was an honor, and I'm still on the board of directors of that organization. I've been, you know, replaced by a new president who's doing a great job, and who I meet with around the corner periodically. But okay, so that's like kind of what I'll say about work for the time being.
Do you want to go into fun and joy?
Fun and joy. Fun and joy. You know, to some extent, and it's an important part of life for me too. I would say that professionally, the richness is in satisfaction, although there was plenty of fun and joy in work. But there's another aspect of life that's not primarily geared at accomplishments. It's the things that you do primarily for fun and joy. And there are many things. You know, I grew up as my father was a physical education teacher and a physical education trainer in the Air Force. So, you know, sports and physical education were important part of my life. But I'm going to limit my discussion about that to three different kind of activities. One was handball. I played handball since I was a child. I started playing competitively in my 30s, and I had some success. I won 3 age category United States National Handball Championships, 3 age category World Championships, an Irish National Championship, many other tournaments. But the real joy was in the physical, the joy of just being involved in a physical activity. B, I think the contribution to psychological and mental health. I mean, there's a sort of a catharsis that occurs in terms of relieving emotion, and also there's a meditative aspect to it, because you're lost when you're playing and competing. You're not thinking. You're just being in that place. And to me, that's more significant than any of the achievements, although it's fun to win. But, and I don't always win. So that's handball. It's been again, a source of tremendous usefulness and fun and joy in my life, and I wouldn't minimize it. I mean, in some ways, life is a day-to-day thing, and it's not inappropriate to measure your life in terms of the moments of pleasure versus the moments of struggle and difficulty. And handball has given me many moments of pleasure. Another area, fun and joy, has been being involved in the theater. I should just take one step backwards and say I started with family and talked about love and the richness of that, but that's also involved a lot of fun and joy. Okay, but anyway, theater. I started doing theater. I took an acting course in college when I showed up, and I performed in, I was Othello at Queens College. I had the lead in a play that was written by a student called Victory Lost. I participated in a production of Ulysses in Nighttown, all during my college years. And then when I was at SCAN, I got involved in a production of, I can't think of the name of the play, but it was a play that Walter Matthau, there was a movie that Walter Matthau did, and I played that part, but it was in a half-an-hour production for Hofstra Television. And when I went out to North Dakota, as I mentioned, I was attracted by the community theater there, and in my 13 years there, I was in about 16 different productions. The first one was, I had the lead in You Can't Take It With You. I was Grandpa. I won Actor of the Year award for my role in on Golden Pond as I can't remember the name of it.
Henry Fonda.
Well, Henry Fonda had played that role, but there was the name of the character. I don't remember. I think my favorite role was in Lost in Yonkers. I was Uncle Louie, but I played in Wait Until Dark, A Bus Stop, Lucky Stiff. Everything you ever needed to know you learned in kindergarten. That was a fun. There was a series of vignettes, and I was also in about 6 musicals. I must say they never gave me a singing part, except I did sing on stage in Lucky Stiff. I had a few solo singing lines. It was a significant risk of liability is. They were concerned that people might hurt themselves trying to leave the theater during that. But anyway, there's something also, tremendous fun and joy, also learning, because the theater community, has some particular qualities, I guess. There's a competitiveness and a supportiveness all at the same time, and then there's trying to become someone else that requires some work, significant amount of work, and makes you think about who you are compared to the character that you're trying to be, and how to make that real for you. So,
There was that story talking about Wait Until Dark, the kid in the...
Oh yeah. So I had in the play Wait Until Dark, I was the assailant, and in Grand Forks, when you completed the production, the cast came out. The audience waited in the lobby, and the cast came out through the lobby so people could make comments. But this little girl, maybe 6 or 7, was in her mother's arms as I walked past, and she stopped me, the little girl, and said, "You are a mean person." So, it was a little painful, but it, on the other hand, felt good about it.
Tribute to your...
Yeah, some of the work that I did in the theater in Grand Forks was done at the university. Some major productions at the university, and also some what they called, can't remember what they called, but closet productions, student productions. A separate piece, I played a Mr. Prudhomme, a teacher in a boys' school in which, there's a conflict about going off to war. It was, powerful. Anyway, so, I also, throughout my life, really had an interest in chess. And for a while I was into it. I was playing in chess tournaments, but mostly, again, for fun. It's a different, sports, theater, chess, different physical, it's much more than physical, artistic, much more than artistic, cerebral, and more than cerebral, but all, a source of fun and joy. So,
Just one other thing, I was just looking at my notes. You'd said handball was the thing that kept me alive to this day.
Yeah. When I was first diagnosed in 2006, Aura and John and I, John, my son, met for a second, or I don't know if it was a third or fourth opinion, with a doctor in Cedar Sinai Hospital in California. And he was very direct and told us that I had 10 months to live. He said that this cancer had metastasized. And, anyway, I had, another operation after that, and I did chemotherapy for a while. And but all the time, 5 of my handball championships came after I was diagnosed with cancer. So the continuing with that competitive activity, I believe, and my doctor, my oncologist also thinks that really helped to extend my life. That, we were talking to Joelle yesterday. She's our daughter, who's a pulmonary therapist in Boston, that one of the struggles that she and her colleagues have is when people become short of breath, they stop, activity. They become more, I don't know what the word for it, sedimentary, and that tends to exacerbate the condition. And for me, handball, staying with it consistently is the opposite of whatever the word is, sedentary. And, I think it's really, I think I'd probably have died several years earlier if I hadn't maintained that. And even now, when I'm, my ability is diminished considerably, and I need to call timeouts. Your stamina was a big part of my game, but I still play. I played yesterday, and I played Wednesday, and it's okay. Anyway, so I think it's I'm grateful to that that activity for sustaining me.
Let me ask you something. I think you've covered all the areas. But,
No, I didn't talk about formal education.
Oh, okay.
And, I do have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a law degree. So I've been in school for many years. But, I don't want to say too much about it. I wasn't a very good student. And I can't say that I learned a great deal. There are certain things from my formal education that I remember that are important to me. One of them I talked about, that English teacher. But it was not so much about learning English as, getting a bit of a look into myself. But I do want to say that I was a troubled young person. You lose your mother when you're 6 years old. She was 29. I had two sisters. A father who was at his wit's end, who himself had lost his mother at an early age. Nobody talked about death. It was, I sort of became unconscious, kind of a cruel kid, certainly a problem in school. People, teachers, principals wrote home, called my father in. He was a teacher. He was at his wit's end about what to do with me. But I had some teachers. A fifth grade teacher, can't remember his name, took an interest in me. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate it, but, he gave me a bit of a sense that I mattered, that I was somebody, there was something there. And like I said, I wasn't conscious enough to fully appreciate it, but it created something. And then in the 9th grade, when I was still a troublemaker, I had an English teacher named Mr. Smoller. I went back to thank him. As an adult, he had already passed away. I so regret that I didn't have that opportunity, because who knows where I would be if if not for him. And in part, it was academic. I mean, he gave me an appreciation, particularly for poetry. I mean, I can recite some substantial poems to this day that I was first introduced to in his class. But more than that, again, he was very direct in hammering home that he felt there was more to me than being, an athlete, a bully, a screw up. A significant part of me started to believe it. And again, it was, I wasn't ready to fully take that in. I wouldn't say it turned me around. I went to high school, I still had a gambling problem. But I became much more sensitive to other human beings. I lost a lot of my cruelty at that time. I was still, what's the word for anti-authority? There's a word for that, but I can't remember what it is. But it made such a huge difference. And part of the reason I'm emphasizing this is I want people to have a sense of what good teachers can do and what many of them do. And I don't know, I guess some of them get thanked for it. I hope other people that were influenced by Mr. Smoller got an opportunity to thank him. But, it's a good teacher. You can't pay them enough, and so I'm very grateful. In terms of the rest of my formal education, I remember things, some specific things from experimental psychology, which gave me an understanding of how people learn, about what motivates people, what the complexity of that, and obstacles to learning. I did, there were a few things that in all these years of formal education, in my graduate school of social work, in my second year, I had a supervisor, Murray Rame, who, this is where, at this time, I was struggling with some of my ongoing issues in a psychoanalytic procedure. I was going 5 days a week to see an analyst, 8 o'clock in the morning till 9. And, one of the things I was struggling with was where my anti-authority came from. But while I was struggling with that, I had this authoritarian but caring supervisor. We were supposed to write process records, an analytic description of the work we were doing, and it submit to him 2 days before the supervisory meeting. And so he would have a chance to look at that and deal with you about the work that you're doing. So one day I came in, I had not submitted the process recordings, and he said to me, "Where are your process recordings?" I said, I had trouble remembering what happened during the sessions. Well, he was a small guy. He stood up, he pounded his fist on the desk. His veins were sticking out on his neck. He says, "Get the fuck out of here. And don't you ever come to your supervision not prepared." I mean, one incident taught me something about taking your job seriously and how to express caring. Because to me, it was embarrassing. I can't say I was scared, because he was a scary person physically, but he scared me on a certain level. And again, eye-opening. I never came unprepared again to that. And I always took supervision seriously. I learned a lot about myself. I had a number of good supervisors, beginning with the one at the Lenox Hill Neighborhood Association. But that second year, was and that experience at Jacoby Hospital significant experience. Anyway, God, I remember I was working with a group of adolescents on the psychiatric unit in front of a one-way mirror. This was a big honor for a student to be able to do this. And in the past, they had people take turns, you know, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, social workers. But when they had me do it, they let me do it for the whole year. And afterwards, there would be a discussion about what had taken place. I mean, it was tremendous. It was an honor. I learned a lot because I got a lot of feedback. But the thing that I remember most was at the end, when I told the group that I was leaving and we were going to have an ending, I offered them an opportunity to plan an ending party, you know, and they planned what they wanted to have, music and refreshments and stuff like that, and dancing, you know, all in front of the one-way mirror. And so, you know, we had this ending, and I danced, you know, and afterwards at the evaluation, you know, whoever was facilitating suggested that people give me feedback, and one of the, I guess, residents in psychiatry, a woman said, well, I think he has more guts than grace. That was, you know, true. I wasn't much of a dancer. But, you know, so that was a piece of my formal education where actually that one year, you know, without the other few anecdotes, and maybe there were some others where I learned much more about every aspect of life in my work than I did, and even in the relatively not relative, but the non-professional jobs, you know, the parking lot and the loading trucks and post office and on that I did than I did in my formal education. So, you know, I think, and you know, let me say one other thing about that. In regard to my profession of social work, which I love, I've noticed that there are people who have no professional training that have incredible capacity to help other people. And there are people with PhDs and significant publishing records who I like and respect, but I would not send anybody I cared about to them for help. So, you know, I think we have to, probably in every area, not just in social work, be cautious about how we evaluate. And to, you know, there are criteria that we overlook. Even in teaching, you know, when I did have a New York City teaching license, and I remember, you know, taking a test and saying to myself, and having an interview, and saying to myself, these questions on the test and from the interviewer have nothing to do with the capacity to manage a classroom and to teach. And then I remember they're raising the requirements, like to 30 credits above the bachelor's and 30 credits above the master's. And, you know, I mean, to this day, I love the profession of teaching. I'm grateful for wonderful teachers. But it seems to me that the teachers' unions are just not focused on what the fundamental needs of students are. Not the individual teachers, but the union. And also, systemically, we don't pay attention to the fact that different communities, different neighborhoods require different skills. There need to be different criteria for teachers that teach in minority neighborhoods in inner cities, in rural areas, in suburban areas. It's not the same set of skills. We pretend that it is. In some places, 60 credits above the master's. It's like, what does it have to do with anything in terms of managing a 7th grade classroom? Anyway, I don't know. Sometimes I get on my soapbox. But these things are, significant parts of who I am.
So that finishes your categories.
Yes,
Can
it
I ask
does.
you a question?
Sure.
You were talking about how, 10 years ago, when you were talking about the handball and how that, for the last 10 years since your original diagnosis, how that would affect you. I'm just wondering, 10 years ago you were told you had, a few months to live?
10 months, yeah.
10 months left. And now you've had 10 more years, and who knows? Maybe it'll be another 10 years. You don't know.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that then?
Right.
So, what do you feel like, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, how the last 10 years have been for you in terms of having extra time that you didn't think that you would have?
Well, the first response is I have tremendous gratitude for what I consider extra time. And, a unique opportunity, not unique, other people deal with death and dying, but to have so much time to think about, having a terminal illness and what that means, and, how to talk about it, and what feels supportive, and, thinking about how I am with response to other people I know who are sick and how I respond to them. It's been, again, a richness. But from the beginning, sitting after that meeting with the doctor in California that said, I had 10 months to live, Aura and John and I went out to lunch. And I remember saying a couple of things. One is, I intend to live my life to the full and appreciate the time that I have. But when it comes time where I don't, the benefit is not worth the price, I, intend to take charge of the ending. And, I asked these people who I love so much to be respectful of that. And they did indicate that they would be. So, that's an important thing to me that, I think we have a problem as a species, and maybe particularly in Western society, accepting, the reality that life is a gift, but it's a temporary gift, and that death is a part of life, and that it's okay. It's, I don't know exactly what we do or fail to do that makes it so terrifying and difficult to come to grips with. But, I think it would be much better if people had the right to die with dignity, that they could get assistance from the medical profession, that the decision making would be respected. So, these are things that over the 10 years I've thought about, grappled with, and, as I feel I'm approaching the end, I approach it with gratitude, with joy, and, without fear. No, maybe not completely without fear, but, by and large, with a sense of completeness and satisfaction. Very grateful for the life that I've had and for the people.
To be able to say.
In my discussion of family, I left out some of the most important people in my life, my siblings. My God, how could I forget that? My siblings and their extended families. My goodness, dealing with the loss of a mother with, my two sisters. Again, what would I be, if they weren't there? And, my brother, who is a half brother, but that's not how I think of him. He's my brother, and he's just a person I love and respect. As I do all my siblings, and also I couldn't imagine like a significant falling out between any of us. My sister can call me an idiot sometimes when we're discussing some, political or cerebral concept, but it's just impossible to think of carrying anger forward between any of us. I just don't see it, and it's a gift, that's people who you love and who love you. What's the word? Unconditionally, right? And their progeny, my nephews and nieces, all of whom are, and grandnephews and nieces, all of whom are such beautiful people. I feel like I should spend an hour talking about each of them, but I need to tell them personally, and I have to some extent, how significant they've all been to me, and how proud I am that they're part of my family, from the siblings on down to their children and grandchildren.
Do you, it's gonna sound like a Charlie Rose question, but sometimes it's a good question.
Yeah.
How do you, all these people who clearly, you've been so much to, you've been such a giving, incredibly, giving, caring person to so many people, close to you, extended people, all these people. And I can imagine what they all must feel about you, and how would you like them to remember you?
Well, I once, I don't know why this is emotional for me. I wrote a little poem about, that's not even, it's too simple to call it a poem, but it about dying, said, mourn me not when I am gone, dig no grave for me, but joyous dance with what I gave. It's quite enough for me. And I don't really want people necessarily to think of me, I want them to joyous dance, and I want them, actually, people that I love, to not give me credit for their accomplishments or their satisfactions. Whatever they have, none of us live in a vacuum. We all get things. We can't survive without positive relationships in our life. But when you're successful, and when I think of successful, I think first of being happy, being a good parent, things like that. You should feel full credit. I don't want anybody to say, I don't mind if there's this, like, I have gratitude towards some of my teachers, but, I want people to feel like it's them, not me. So I don't care if they don't even associate me with their joy. If I contributed to it, that's fine. And for people I love, even if I didn't contribute, if they're joyous, it's fine for whatever reason they're joyous. I realize that we don't, even if people remember us and give us credit or whatever they do or don't do, this lasts maybe 2 generations. In 2 generations, you're basically forgotten. As even if you're famous, you're remembered, in some kind of, the storybook kind of a thing, but nobody remembers you in terms of your personal relationship with them. But I must say, I just want to tell this other little anecdote. I don't remember when it was. Let's say Mika is 14 or something now, 13. He's going to be 14. Must be about 6 years ago. Maybe 5 years ago. I'm driving with him in the car. I remember we went shopping or something. And we're talking about a movie or something with ghosts. So I said to him, what's a ghost? He says, well, if you die, your spirit flies around. So I said, do you believe in that? He said, no. So I said, well, what do you think happens when you die? And he said, this little kid, you live on in the dreams of the people that love you. I don't know. But, I don't need to live on in anybody's dreams. I think that I've had an impact. I feel good about the impact. And, that's enough to take with me. I'm not invested in other people's perception of it. Although I realize that, I've gotten a lot of love back for anything that I've given. And it's been more than worth it.